Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to look at Chandragupta Maurya, who is the leader of the very first Mauryan Empire in India, and learn a little bit about him and what he established within his empire. So a little bit of an overview. As I said, he is the first ruler in the Mauryan dynasty, the Mauryan Empire, what will become the Mauryan Empire. He is the father of the Emperor Bindusara, and perhaps more notably, he's the grandfather of the Emperor Ashoka. And we're going to talk about Ashoka another time because Ashoka is notable in his own right for what he does for the empire. Ashoka, in addition, it's under Ashoka's reign that their empire really reaches its peak, its full power. And so a lot of that has to do with what's started by Chandragupta and builds over time. The Mauryan Empire in history becomes, once they reach their full power, it becomes the largest empire ever to exist in the Indian subcontinent. So that portion of the continent that makes up India. It is the largest empire ever, and it is, for its time, also considered one of the most powerful empires, in addition to its large size. So Chandragupta himself is born in 340 BCE. He dies in 298 BCE, just shortly after he leaves power. He rules starting in 322 BCE, and again, his rule ends in 298 BCE, shortly before he dies. Before Chandragupta gains power of the empire, India is made up of many, many small independent states, and there's a lot of territory in what modern-day India and the areas surrounding that are not under the control yet of this empire. And so over time, Chandragupta vastly increases the size of the empire, as do his descendants. He is the first to also unify these independent states under one central government with one sort of focused bureaucracy to then rule over the empire. And this is the first time in history that this happens in the region of India. So a little bit of background. During Chandragupta's time, before he becomes the emperor, he is influenced by the events that are occurring around him. Alexander the Great had moved into the region, into the what is now India in about 326 BCE. So that's a few years before, 4 years before Chandragupta comes to power. And he and his army conquer a large region of the area. And in one particular place, modern-day Punjab, in a region within India, Alexander actually allies himself with the leader there and decides to stay and ends up hanging out for a while in that region. Over time, his army, Alexander's army, the Macedonians, become kind of frustrated with him and like the lack of movement and the lack of adventure, I suppose. And they mutiny and they leave. And so Alexander loses a lot of his army in that region, and they leave. So when this happens, it presents an interesting opportunity for Chandragupta. Chandragupta is a noble member of the caste system. India has, at this time and for much longer afterwards, a caste system where you are born into a caste and it determines your occupation and your status. And Chandragupta is born into the Kshatriya caste, which is a very powerful caste. The people of that caste are the ones that are the kings and the rulers of the states. They are the government officials, they're the military leaders, and so they're people who have power. So Chandragupta is born into that caste, and he is actually related to the family that is ruling at the time, but for many reasons they don't get along, and he is actually exiled when this begins. So his dislike of the existing ruling family, as well as Alexander and his Macedonians ultimately leaving, presents this opportunity for Chandragupta. He wants to not only gain some control, but also rid India of the influence of Alexander and his army. So they, again, had been there for a while and kind of infiltrated much of the culture. And Chandragupta wants to rid India of those influences. So he begins plans to gain power. A good friend of his advisor, who ultimately becomes his prime minister, works with him. They establish a very small army, and even though it's small in numbers at first, they are very well trained. They're very successful. His friend, his advisor, turns out to be a very talented military leader, and they are able to have this small but powerful army, and they march on the capital city. Now, because of, again, the situation with the Macedonians leaving, the ruling family that is currently in power, as I said, is rumored and believed by many to be a very corrupt family. And so there are already, in addition to Chandragupta, there are already groups of people that would support the overthrow of the existing leader. When Chandragupta and his army enter the capital city, just their presence and kind of the idea of an overthrow sparks a civil war between those who support the current royal family and those who are wanting to overthrow them and to bring in new leadership. So when all is said and done, after this war, Chandragupta, Alexander's gone. Chandragupta gains control. He is able to seize the throne from the ruler. He has gained supporters. He has shown his military strength, and he becomes the leader, and he begins what he calls the Mauryan dynasty, the Mauryan Empire. The Mauryan dynasty, the Mauryan Empire will rule. The family itself will rule until 185 BC. So about 150 years, this family line will rule India. Under Chandragupta's reign, India grows substantially. Ultimately, their control would spread from the Indus River in the west all the way east to the Bay of Bengal. So it grows significantly. He increases the territory. In addition, he goes to some of the outlying areas where some remnants still remain of Alexander and his Macedonian army, and he's able to push them back to gain some further influence and push those invaders away. He also rids what now is Afghanistan of Greek invaders, and so he moves back a lot of these groups that are trying to move into the territory, while he is also increasing his own empire. Because of this, people that didn't already support him begin to view him as a very brave and capable leader. And so he continues to grow in fame and in support because of his quick action right away, right? As soon as he's in power and the power grows, the empire is increasing and becoming more powerful as well. Eventually, Alexander the Great dies. And when this happens, again, Chandragupta works with some of those outlying territories to rid that influence or those the presence of the invaders in some outer regions, and he establishes treaties to establish the borders around what would become his empire, to legally establish the borders around what would be his empire. Chandragupta seizes the territory of what is now modern-day Pakistan. So again, expanding the army over time. Pakistan, by the way, is a fairly new country in the scheme of things. Pakistan doesn't exist until the late 40s, 1940s, and it is carved out of India. So for a very long time, that territory belongs to India and the leaders of India. So Chandragupta, again, he's known as this brave military leader, and people who visit his palace, the records, the diaries, the interviews that we see in the ancient writings about those that went to his palace or those who worked in the palace, remark that it was very, very luxurious. It was a very opulent and extravagant palace, and the people who lived there lived very extravagantly. But what's interesting is that with the exception of sort of his initial attempts to push out the empire of India, Chandragupta lives in the palace for most of his reign as a total recluse, voluntarily. People don't see him. He doesn't leave the palace. He still continues to order directives and make decisions involving expanding the territory. So his army is still out there working, his government is still out there working, but he himself almost goes into hiding for whatever reason. We're not quite sure. But he never leaves the palace, and people don't see him. For 24 years, the last 24 years of his rule, he's hiding away in his palace, even though his government and his empire continues to grow. Again, it grows north and south. There is one small exception, the Kalinga, which is in the southeastern region of India. He does work to get that territory. He's never really successful, but by the time his grandson Ashoka becomes ruler, Ashoka seizes it. So he gets that last little piece that his grandfather wasn't able to gain in that lower peninsula of India. So in addition to the reports of the extravagant life at the palace, we have reports about his army and what it was made up of. It's pretty impressive. So in addition to being just, again, this great military leader with his advisor, who's also known as a very advanced military leader, Chandragupta's army is believed to have included 600,000 soldiers. It's the numbers for their horses are impressive. They're believed to have 30,000 horses that they would use in their army for battle and for expansion. And then, this is my favorite part, 9,000 war elephants. That's pretty impressive, 9,000 war elephants. I think one war elephant would be impressive. I don't think we could assume that all 9,000 were used at once, of course, but I'm not sure how many would constitute not a scary number. Even if you had 3 or 4 elephants coming at you in battle, that would be pretty intimidating. But it's believed that Chandragupta had over 9,000 elephants that he would use, along with his foot soldiers and the horses, to try to expand his territory and protect his territory. It's pretty impressive. Chandragupta makes the decision in 298 BCE to voluntarily abdicate his throne. This doesn't happen very much in history. It happens sometimes. We'll see a few other examples, but it doesn't happen very often. He voluntarily chooses to step down from the throne. And in the case of his dynasty, his son, Bindusara, takes his place as the emperor. And he just sort of walks away. It is believed that he, over time, begins to follow some of the spiritual aspects of the religious teachings known as Jainism, which argue for salvation and spirituality through striving for perfection, and in some cases through suffering. And so it is believed that Chandragupta becomes very devoted to these religious teachings, and he embarks on a pilgrimage. And one of the aspects of this belief system is, as I said, that idea of salvation through suffering. And so Chandragupta likely participated in activities that were intentional to create suffering in order for him to then gain spirituality and salvation. And we see some other religious systems that include these things, but harming or, again, intentionally behaving in a way that causes suffering. And so when Chandragupta dies on this pilgrimage, he is found in a cave, and the cause of death is determined that he dies of starvation. So there's a lot of debate as to whether it was an act of this pursuing suffering and maybe just, an unfortunate side effect of him trying to embrace the spiritual aspect by intentionally depriving himself of food, and if that's what led to his starvation, or whether it was somehow accidental in another way, that he maybe became trapped, or he just ran out of access to food and starved, or whether it was an intentional death. But he did die on his pilgrimage shortly after leaving the throne to his son, Bindusara. So again, he's worth noting for his important role in unifying India, unifying those separate states, and then significantly growing the territory. He sets the stage for a lot of the things that will come in India, and we'll talk about Ashoka, his grandson, and the things that he contributes to India on another day. So thanks for watching, guys. See you later.